Hello, this is the second video for Seminar 3. If you can open your PowerPoint slides, I'm just starting with slide 9 again, where in the first part of this lecture we looked at Rothman's typology or different models of community work, and mainly been organised in three areas: the community development or locality development, social planning and social action. So that table that is on slide 9 just helps you to organise and to see the fundamental differences between each of those types of community work. However, I just want to stress that one does not mean that a worker would not be working in another area as well. So for example, a community development worker who is working in a local area with a good group of people to address an issue may also be involved in some social planning activities as well. It's important to see and understand what these different types of work are and what they mean, but also remember that they actually can overlap. We're going to move on in this part of the lecture, have a look at Popple's models of community work. So again, here is another person's writing and thinking about community work and organising it in a way to help us to understand the different types of community work. And that's from Popple's book, Analysing Community Work, Its Theory and Practice, and Stepney and Popple, Social Work in the Community, A Critical Context for Practice. While those books are not essential reading for this course, we're just having a look at this model because it again highlights the different ways that community work can be talked about and can be organised. So on slide 11, just having a look at the 8 different areas that we're going to explore over these next few minutes. They've broken down the models of community work into 8 different areas, and firstly on slide 12 we're going to have a look at community care and what is meant by community care. So they talk about community care as being attempts to cultivate social networks or voluntary services for the concerned residents or people in a community. So it concentrates on self-help and developing self-help concepts to address a social or a welfare need. And often in that type of work, family is seen as the locus or the centre of care. So one example of community care might be that workers work with a group of parents who are concerned about the behaviour of or looking after teenage kids, for example. So a worker might be setting up a group with some parents to get them together to talk about how can we respond to our kids, how can we look after our kids, how can we deal with behaviours that we're concerned about. But instead of working with people individually, a worker might organise people into a group and work with them that way. So the family is often seen as the centre, and there can be controversy around this model because it can be seen that there's a shifting of the cost away from the state to the community. So rather than services being provided, that people are expected to deal with issues within their own resources. Community organisation, this model again comes from the UK, and so this term community organisation is looking at how to improve the way that organisations and agencies work with each other, so to avoid duplicating or overlapping of services. So one example that I can think of with this could be a network of workers, for example, where workers who perhaps are youth workers who are working with young people in different organisations, maybe a not-for-profit, maybe a government department, maybe a mental health service. Different organisations might get together and talk about how can we work together to address the issues of young people, how can we work together and not overlap or not be doing the same work in the same place. So it's about networking and communicating between different services. Community development is also talked about in this model, and again it's defined as assisting groups, so groups of people, residents, people in a community, people in a street, people in an area, assisting them to acquire the skills and the confidence to address the issues that they want to address, and that ultimately that's about improving people's quality of lives, or about dealing with something that's impacting on how people are living in that area. So the emphasis of the work in community development, in Popple's, Stepney's term, is the emphasis on the developmental aspects of the work. So at every level of the work in community development, it's about developing skills, it's about working with the capacity of the members, the community members, the residents, working with them to address an issue. So the worker's role in community development is to focus very much and to look at what the direction is that the community, the people that they're working with, what's the direction that they want to go. So the worker is actually proactively supporting and contributing to that process. Community planning, again, you will be familiar with this term. Again, Popple and Stepney's work, they talk about it as looking at the social conditions, social policies, the different agency services, how goals and priorities are set, how programs are set, designed and delivered, how to get the resources to deliver those programs. So my example in the previous video about a government provided housing service, looking at how to best communicate with the tenants who are living in those houses and to tell them we need to address the problem, the houses are falling down, this is our plan, this is what we think we're going to do, and talking to the residents in those houses. That's one example again of community planning. There is criticism as well around community planning, that it's driven by the notion that the poor person, the disadvantaged person is in a position where they're actually having work done to them or for them. The focus is not necessarily on developing people's skills and involving people in a process. It's much more focused on an outcome. Community education stands alone in this particular model as an attempt to redirect educational policy and practices to bring the community into a closer and a more equal relationship. So the idea of school-based village, education is paid for by the state, the working class adult education, so adult education courses that enable people who haven't finished schooling to develop skills, to improve literacy, to access jobs. Community education is seen as one particular type of community work. And you need to be aware of the work of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator who has contributed hugely to this area and talks about education as a tool for liberation, and that education as a way of empowering people to address the issues in their lives. However, he's very much focused on the process of education, that it's relevant. He also has introduced words like praxis and conscientisation, and that political action is influenced by the education of people. His work has been hugely influential and forms the foundation of a lot of community work, because a lot of community work does have community education as part of it. One of the things that I just wanted to say about Freire as well is that education isn't neutral, that education can be used to liberate people or domesticate people. So the content of education is really important, but he really talks about it as being a tool for liberation. and talks about the potential for education to be transforming. Community action is reacting to or responding to some paternalism is reacting to the paternalism of some of the community work models. And so it's usually the response by people who themselves are affected by a problem. And one of the examples that we spoke about in the class is the Salt March by Gandhi, for example, who, as a massive social action, community action, poor people in India walked right across the country to demonstrate, to show that they were not prepared to accept Britain's control over them in the production of salt. And there's lots of examples about community action that's very much about people who, from their own experience, get together, get organised, and decide to take a step. So the key word in that is action, to put their concerns into some action, to communicate that they don't want to remain powerless. So it's usually addressing their power imbalance, and there may be issues that are outside people's immediate control, but they take an action to address it. Feminist community work is identified as another model. The central aim of feminist community work is the involvement of women's welfare by collectively challenging the social determinants of women's inequality. So it's looking again at the inequality in society, and particularly the inequality that women experience, and addressing that, and usually addressing it in a collective way that includes getting women together, includes informing and educating women and valuing women's experience to address an issue. When we're actually looking at institutional gender disadvantage and how that limits and restricts the life opportunities of women, it actually comes into many parts of community work. And feminist community work offers a critique of patriarchy and then provides particular ways of addressing women's movement, women's action to address those issues. The quote here from Henry Dunant: "The influence of women is an essential factor in the welfare of humanity, and it will become more valuable as time proceeds." And there are many examples of powerful community work being done through the actions and through the engagement of women. This model also looks at black and anti-racist community work as a particular part of community work that again has been very strong in America and also in the UK, that black and anti-racist community work addresses traditional forms of community work haven't always included and haven't always met the needs, particularly of the black and other disadvantaged communities. And so it really very much puts racism at the centre of the discourse around community work, to challenge the institutional and personal racism, to name that and to challenge that in the way that the work is done. So there's been community projects that are specifically initiated by, organised by black population, by Indigenous groups, particularly to name and respond to the exclusion that they've experienced from a white-dominated service, for example, and the racism that operates in neighbourhoods for all ethnic minority groups, including people's freedom to express their cultural, religious and language expressions. These issues are addressed through black and anti-racist community work. And it also acknowledges that Western approaches to working in communities often focus much more on individualism, and that many cultures are collective, and that the processes in other community work haven't always addressed the needs of this group. I'm actually looking at slide 20 now. And on slide 20 you'll see there's a page there that has quite a detailed table that just highlights for you what the differences between each type of community work practice, talks about what the strategy is, and in particular what the role or the title of the worker might be in that type of work. So if we just look at a couple for a minute, if we look at that first one, community care, and what the role of the worker in that might be, it may be as an organiser, it may be as a volunteer, and it may be organising, working with groups of people with disabilities, or as we were talking before about working with a group of parents, and the worker's role is quite particular to organise. If we go to community development, for example, as the model, and look at the strategy that's involved there, it's about assisting the groups to acquire skills and confidence, to improve their quality of life, and that really involves the people in that group to be actively involved. The worker's role in that instance is more of an enabler, a neighbourhood worker, a facilitator. So the worker's role there is to facilitate, to support these processes to happen. And if we have a look at community action, for example, further down, it's usually class-based, conflict-focused, direct action at a local level. The role of the worker, or their title, might be more of an activist. And there are some examples there of that sort of work: welfare rights, squatting movement, resistance against planning and redevelopment, tenants, action groups. There's lots of different examples. So have a look at that table, and again, it's just another way that thinking and talking about community work has been organised in a way that you can have a look at the different parts of community work to help you to start thinking about what these terms mean, and to be really clear about how you will define them when you talk about them. Again, don't be too confused or overwhelmed by that. The final slide 21 just talks about the continuum, really, the different types of community work, and how in the way that 12 Trees looked at it, and people would remember that reading from their very first the very first week of Module 1, looks at the continuum of how different community development might be. For example, from social planning, that fundamentally the goals of community development may be quite different to the goals of social planning. However, there also can be an overlap with each of those. And for example, with self-help, the focus is on people developing skills, getting organised, addressing issues for themselves, but also there can be a place for influencing the services that people access. So that typology, that 12 trees on that final slide 21, is just a summary again of some of the different parts of community work, the different elements of community work. So the enabling role of the worker, for example, the worker can have a role where their focus is on stepping back, supporting other people to get the skills, to get the resources, to get to address issues in the way that they want to address them. And the role of the worker can be to enable that to happen. It can also include taking a lead and actually having to, at times, organise events, take the initiative, organise meetings, arrange things, be proactively involved in setting up meetings between a group of residents, for example, and their local council to address the issue of their housing, or to address the issue in their street of the maintenance that hasn't been done on the footpaths, for example. So the role of the worker can be that broad that encompasses different aspects and different steps. So have a look at that one as well. With looking at models and theories over the last 2 weeks, there is a lot to take in. So it's just important for you to have a sense of and to be practicing using these terms and to start to feel confident about what they mean, and to be very clear when you use the term about what you mean, but at the same time to be aware that there is an overlap with how people use these different terminology. What you'll notice while you're listening and while you're reading is that some of these theories and some of these models will appeal to you more than others, and that's good. Because you'll need to be able to talk about that in your assignment. And again, just emphasising that none of these are right or wrong. They're just different ways to understand and explain the very deliberate and purposeful focus on working in communities. That's all for today.